new stuff for today. We're going to get into mollusks and echinoderms, the last two invertebrate heavy phyla to talk about before we breach core dates next week. And as we zoom into this animal tree of life, in terms of lophotrochozoan clades, the two main phyla we see are the annelids and the mollusks. We've just crossed annelids off, so we're about to focus on the mollusks, and the other one that we're going to mention later on are these echinoderms. Jumping into the mollusks. As we have been doing, we're going to go through general characteristics of this entire phyla, and then we'll look more closely at four classes of mollusks and talk about differences between them, things that distinguish each class from one another. First, shared characteristics between all mollusks. And some of this is redundant. We've been talking about since last lecture. We're now on the branch of animal life that is dealing with bilaterally symmetrical organisms. We know if they're bilaterally symmetrical, they've got three germ layers. We call that triploblastic, and they all have true body cavities. In the branch of lophotrochozoans, we said these phyla at some stage in their life cycle have a lophophore that they use to feed. In mollusks, this feeding apparatus is in the larval stage, so they have what we called Trochophore larvae. This one that we're looking at is going to be what we will call a chitin, and it has a shell that's made up of 8 plates. These little rows of plates form a shelled dome that protect this soft organism that's underneath. What it's currently doing underneath there is scraping the algae that's off of the rock surface. If we look at another one of these mollusks, this is a snail. We recognize the snail because it has this little spiraled shell. If we were to look inside the body of this snail, there's going to be 3 recognizable parts that all mollusks are going to have. One of them is this foot that they use to get around. We see the snail moving around on the foot. The other part is the mantle, which you can't currently see on this snail because the mantle is covered up by the shell. And then inside that shell, there are some of the other internal organs. The body of this snail is called the visceral mass. Let's look at a cross-section through that. What we're looking at is not a snail anymore, but this is a cross-section through that chitin, this structure. If we could look underneath that shell, it would look something like this, where right underneath that shell there is this blue, well, in this slide they've colored it in blue. That is this structure called the mantle. And we said in mollusks that have a shell, the shell comes from secretions of the mantle. So in this case, we can see that shell right on top of the mantle. Underneath the mantle, you can see what that shell is protecting. It's protecting the body of this organism, what we call the visceral mass. And you can see the other organ systems kind of within that visceral mass, within the body of the mollusk. And then what this mollusk uses to get around is the foot. We'll see a couple of video clips of this thing using the foot to move around. Something else that's noteworthy, some of these mollusks are going to have a specialized feeding apparatus called a radula. You can think of a radula as a conveyor belt of teeth. And it uses this conveyor belt of teeth to, like we said, scrape algae off the rocks. It reminds me of sometimes I see, I don't know what piece of equipment it is, but it's like some big piece of road equipment that has on the front of it what looks like a big long chainsaw blade. And when they get that thing going, it's just like this conveyor belt that has these little buckets that dig up the ground. And I think they use it to dig trenches. And that thing, that conveyor belt, these little buckets that are digging up little bites of the ground, function just like this radula does, except we said that's scraping algae off the rocks. I think I actually have a video of that. We're about to see that. I have a link that takes us to showing us how a radula works. This is that little row of teeth. It's kind of hard to tell in this picture, so let's make it move and we can see the radula work. Not all mollusks are going to have that radula as their feeding apparatus. Other mollusks are predatory and are not going to care about scraping algae off the rock. They're going to go after prey items that are vertebrates. In this case, this is a cone snail that has harpooned a fish and is about to engulf that fish. Here is the Radula working. These are all very short video clips.
The Radula is a tool possessed only by shellfish.
But you can kind of see that conveyor belt of teeth. Now, that's not the only way that they hunt. Let's look at this. Here it is.
When some cone snails go hunting, they like to burrow into the sand and wait. When a meal happens by, the cone snail fires its harpoon.
See, there's just that little harpoon that was sticking up.
The poisons quickly paralyze the fish.
Let's see, where were we in the slides? We're still looking at general characteristics of all of these mollusks. So we'll go back to here. We mentioned those three body parts that they all have, the mantle, the visceral mass, and the foot. Some of them have a shell. And this is one that does not have a shell. It is a sea slug. So I'm just going to jump to a couple of pictures. I'm going to jump to these two pictures because I want to show the difference between a snail and a slug. These snails have a shell, slugs don't have a shell. This is the mantle that would normally secrete a shell, and this one just hasn't secreted a shell. The point I'm trying to make here is that there are slugs and there are snails. When they are terrestrial, just like when we were looking at flatworms, remember how the terrestrial flatworm, that free-living flatworm, was kind of drab colored. It was the same color as dirt. It was kind of brown colored. Whereas those marine flatworms, we saw that video of the marine flatworm kind of using its flat body to move through the water. And all of those marine flatworms are very pretty and colorful and very showy. Same thing happens when we look at terrestrial mollusks. So the snail that is terrestrial and the slug that is terrestrial is rather drab colored. But if we look at marine snails or marine slugs, this is a marine slug. It doesn't have a shell, but you can see it still, like most marine organisms, is very colorful and showy. That structure that we see that has all the surface area, that's the gill that it uses to breathe. There's a bunch of blood vessels through there, enough surface area for gas exchange to occur. We see complete digestive systems in mollusks, so a mouth and a separate anus. We know they're bilaterally symmetrical, so we see a cephalization, a head region versus a tail region. All the nerve endings are congregated at one end of the organism. So those are general characteristics of mollusks. We now are going to jump into 4 different class examples. And I know I haven't given myself room to write these on the board, but you can bet that whenever we get to our review, when we look ahead at mollusks, there's going to be 4 classes that we need to be aware of. The first class of mollusks are called Polyplacophora. You can think of that Polyplacophora. This just means many plaques that are, it refers to them being glued together as a shell. Polyplacophora is a class that includes that organism we saw previously as the chitin. Here is the chitin. We can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then the last one is that 8th tiny plate. So rows of 8 plates form this domed shell. I added this sketch that shows the first little scale. It's really 8 of those plates that form this domed shell. If we could look underneath the organism, here is the mussel-like mollusk. It has a radula mouth part that we saw in the video scraping algae. There's that radula. So chitins, that's our first example, Polyplacophora. The second class that we need to be aware of is called gastropods. These are the snails and the slugs. We know snails have a shell, slugs don't. And to recognize the class gastropod, it's helpful to see a shell. So snails are going to be easily recognizable as gastropods because if we look at the shell is going to spiral. And what I mean by spiral is that it comes to a point. Some snail shells are pointier than others. If I just jump to this picture, this is one that comes to a point, but it's not a very narrow point. It's not a very sharp point. This is still what we would describe as a spiraled shell. It spirals in one direction. This is a spiraled shell. That is a spiraled shell. So we see shells on the snails. Slugs don't have the shell, so we can't use that to tell. But we can see those other three parts. There's the foot, there's the visceral mass, which is the body, and then here's that mantle that secretes the shell. If we didn't point this out before, the snails, as we're about to see in the video, they have two sets of tentacles. They have these upper tentacles in which at the ends of those tentacles there are eyes that are capable of looking around and forming a blurry image. And then these lower tentacles are the ones that have sensory structures and are able to smell what's on the ground. This ended up being a fuzzier picture than I like, but it shows this complete digestive system where there's a mouth featuring a radula at one end, and then there's the anus at the other. Complete digestive system. Maybe the most surprising thing about these gastropods is how they reproduce. These are also hermaphrodites, so they have male and female reproductive parts, but they, unlike the parasites, they can't self-fertilize. Like an earthworm, they're going to be looking for a partner in order to stimulate this process of reproduction. Let's see this in a video.
These grow longer and longer. Then they too begin to entwine. They fan out to form a translucent flower-like globe.
Third class is going to be the bivalves, and that is easy to see where they get their name. Each of these bivalves have two halves to a shell that meet at a little hinge point, and that's really kind of the weak point in this organism. We're going to see starfish feed on these bivalves, and they just rip these two halves of the shell apart. If we look inside the two pieces of the bivalve, that's where the organism lives, so we can see the visceral mass. There's even a foot that stick out that allow these things to move around. And if you haven't seen how these bivalves move, so there's two of them side by side, and this little thing sticking off the side is a siphon. I should have showed the other picture. These filter water. So there's a siphon that pulls in water, filters any food out of the water, and then sends fresh water out. There's the foot. It kind of looks like a tongue that it uses to dig. That's how they can burrow into the sand so quickly. And there's that siphon. You see it has two spots. One of them is an entrance for water and the other is an exit for water. This is that muscular foot that it was using to stick out. On the other side there was that siphon. There's an entrance for water. That water is filtered through this pharynx that has holes for water, clean water, to pass out the exit, and any food particles are trapped in the pharynx and pass on through the digestive system. Here's another picture that shows these tiny bean clams, and they have their siphons sticking out of one side, so one of those is a place for water to go in, the other is water to go out, and then you can see that tongue-like foot that's protruding out. Here again is that tongue-like foot. Those were the two video links that we just saw. So bivalves, that is our third class of mollusks, and now we get to the final and what I'm going to consider the most interesting class of mollusks, and that is the cephalopods. If we could just ignore the vampire squid, which seems to be, I guess, this person's favorite squid, it points out that within the cephalopods there are four groups. Only one of the four groups has a shell, and that is this Nautilus. When we look at the shell, we're going to see it's not the same as the gastropod shell that had a point. These Nautilus shells we'll describe as a coiled shell. So they coil rather than spiral. There is no point on a Nautilus shell. But its cousins, the other cephalopods, the octopus, the squid, and the other squid relatives, as well as the cuttlefish, which is kind of a cross between a squid and an octopus. These all lack shells, but in order to make up for the lack of a shell, they all have an incredible ability to camouflage themselves, to change the color and the texture of their skin to match the surrounding habitats. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. And I know I've already said a couple of times how nature is far crazier than anything that can be made up. Let's watch the Nautilus real quick, and then in the next video we'll see cuttlefish. But what's kind of fascinating about these Nautilus is that you don't see flippers. They're not just constantly trying to move water around to stay hovering in this water column. Instead, what you can't see is they have a gas-filled chamber inside that they can adjust by pulling gas out of the bloodstream, things like carbon dioxide and oxygen. It can fill this internal bladder. It's like what a submarine does. It can increase the amount of gas in an internal tube, and that causes the submarine or this Nautilus to float higher up in the water column. Or it can release the gas from that internal chamber and float lower in the water column. So it can adjust its buoyancy with this gas-filled bladder. How it moves around, you can kind of see that rocking shape. It pulls water in through a funnel and then shoots it out of a little siphon that kind of it uses as a jet propulsion. Let's go back just to introduce those other cephalopods. Here is my, well, second favorite video, I'll say that. It's also short. This shows an octopus, and it shows how well they can adapt the surface of their skin to mimic whatever they're next to. This one is next to some green algae. It's just landed on the green algae. Watch how long it takes to change its color and its texture to blend into this algae. Watch quick. I'll show it a couple of times. Let's back this thing all the way up.
This is the mimic octopus.
See that? Here it is again.
This is the mimic.
Almost instantaneously.
A master of disguise.
Octopus. Let's look at, this is the next one, the cuttlefish. We'll only see a few seconds of this, but cuttlefish have taken it a step further. Instead of trying to figure out how to use this camouflage to blend in and not get eaten because they don't have a shell, they actually have used it to hunt. Watch this. They basically hypnotize their prey items. They flash them with these crazy displays, and the prey item's like, what is, probably trying to figure out what it's looking at, and then it's too late.
The predator is a master of illusion,
Oh.
changing its shape and color at will. It can hypnotize its prey, or even become invisible.
They've developed this skin that can do the amazing changes in colour and changes in shape. And you couldn't get a weirder looking animal.
Every place they go.
Okay, we don't got to find all the different species, but they're amazing in how they can change their color and their texture. Squid, oh, there's one more example there. These squid are really moving around in open waters, so they need to kind of make their skin translucent. And this is more recent video, so I think some of the footage is a little bit more detailed, and you can actually see how the cells become so darkly pigmented and then lightly pigmented. It's like these pigment cells are stretchy like a piece of rubber, and you can stretch them out and increase the surface area, and that's what we see in this video. Each one of those pigment cells are attached to muscles that if they contract, they can stretch this pigment out, and if the muscles relax, the pigment cells goes back down to very small. You just look at them change size in real time.
They're called hermatophores. They're like tiny water balloons filled with colored pigment. When the balloons expand, you see more pigment, more color.
Okay, so we will have a lab activity where we look at some examples of cephalopods next time. These are the video links that we just looked at. Included in the cephalopods, we said are Nautilus, the only shelled cephalopod, octopus, cuttlefish, and squid. Again, the non-shelled ones are extremely intelligent. If you want to see the full video of the Kings of Camouflage, I think you can just YouTube search that, but I do have the DVD if anybody wants it. Then we've already talked about the annelid group, so I'm going to skip over that, and we will, in the last few slides, just introduce the Echinoderm Phyla. This just means spiny skin. It's one of the examples of the deuterostome clade. We're going to save chordates for next week and instead focus our last several minutes on the Echinoderm Phyla. All of these organisms have a spiny skin. We're going to see this is the sister group to all of the chordates. So this is just a roadmap of where we're going on Monday and Wednesday of next week. Even within the chordates, there's still a lot of branching that we have to go through before we eventually get to vertebrates. You can see this clade is the vertebrate clade. So there are some examples of chordates that don't have true vertebrae yet. More on that Monday. Let's look at this Echinoderm Phyla. There are many examples of echinoderms. Our most common example of this are going to be the sea stars. These are brittle stars. There are sea urchins and these sea feathers. Even sea cucumbers, they all have these, what are referred to as this water vascular system that are protruding from the bottom surface of these organisms, and they use them as feet to move around. They're called tube feet. And have you ever seen like how a little, like a turkey baster or something with a little suction pad works? What these are pulling in through the bottom of the tube and then pushing back out is water. And it uses these tube feet to move around. We'll see that each of the arms of a starfish has extensive tube feet along its bottom surface. In the video, we're about to see how it uses these tube feet to walk around. But I want to show that also in each one of these arms, in addition to the system that it uses for mobility, the tube feet, it has digestive structures and reproductive structures. So we'll see that in the middle of this sea star on the underside of it, so we can't really see it here, but if we flipped it to the underside, there would be a mouth in the middle part, and it uses these arms to grab things like clams or bivalves, and it uses the tube feet to open up those organisms and ingest that visceral mass. So there are digestive tubes in each of these arms. There are gonads in each of those arms and tube feet at the very bottom. Let's see how this sea star uses the tube feet to move around. I think that's this one. This is not time lapse, so this is kind of in real time how those tube feet move around. It's not a very quick process, but those are very strong tube feet. In fact, if I jump to the next video, you can see in a time lapse how those tube feet are moving quickly to grab this bivalve, funnel it towards the mouth region. And if this video was to go long enough, you can see how it's turning it around to get that hinge in the opposite direction. And it's going to use those tube feet to rip apart those two halves to that shell and ingest that muscle on the inside. The final video that we have, in fact, that's just the final slide so that you can see. We don't go any further than that. This is just an example of an echinoderm. It's one of the larger sea stars called the sunflower sea star. Let's see this thing move in a video. Again, short video.
The sunflower star is a terrifying predator. It's more than 3 feet wide, is replete with 15,000 tube feet, and is one of the fastest animals in its biome.
It's weird to see it moving, in time lapse like this.
This cockle is trying desperately to escape its many-armed doom.
So I'll go back to this one slide, well, maybe here, and point out that we have seen examples of each of these bilateral groups. We've seen our two main examples of Lophotrochozoa was the mollusks and the annelids. We've seen examples of Ecdysozoa. So we've now turned our attention to the deuterostome clade, and we've pointed out those spiny-skinned individuals that belong to the Echinoderm Phyla, all of those sea stars and sea star relatives. So that leaves only one other phyla, the chordate phyla. Not to disappoint, there's going to be a lot of detail in this chordate phyla that we have to get through. So we're going to add, but this is where it gets more relevant, right? We're going to start to see the first chordates that lack any kind of backbone. And this organism, the lamprey, it's crazy. This has if we were to grab this organism, we would feel the stiffened backbone, but it doesn't have a jaw. It has no clasping jaw. It has a sucker-like mouth that it uses almost like one of those tunnel boring machines to dig into the side of a mountain. This mouth part digs into the side of fish. We'll see these lampreys. And then sharks are going to be the first organism to add to the vertebrae a clasping jaw. And then we're going to get to bony fish, then amphibians, reptiles, and eventually mammals. So it gets more and more relevant. So hopefully we'll find that exciting. But that's what we have to look forward to next week. I'll turn the lights on, and if there are any questions left over about the lab reports, I'll be glad to tackle those